Okay, this lesson covers cognitive biases. Um, First point, what is a cognitive bias? Well, we don't always accept things because they're reasonable. The things that we believe, we don't always believe, and some would say a fair number of times, the things that we believe are not always the product of good, solid thinking or logic or reason. Um, um, Many times, the things that we believe are the function of biases that we have. And so, the purpose of this section is to introduce you to some of those belief biases we have, some of those ways that we come to form our beliefs that have nothing to do with good reasoning or good thinking. Um, so be clear that this is something that we're all culpable of, that we're all responsible for, well, that we all do, in fact. Of course, when we do it, we're responsible for it. But as a matter of course, we each have a tendency to believe things um, for reasons that have nothing to do with logic or with reason. And that's an issue because, and let me explain why that's an issue. When we attempt to, or when we arrive at conclusions, when we come to believe things, not based on proper evidence and logic, but based on, I don't know, predispositions, history, other sorts of things, we end up believing them um, to be true without a very good reason. And it leads to false beliefs and biases against people, things, places, all sorts of things. This is something that everyone struggles with, including, those most well versed in logic. If you watch the Star Trek series at all, that's the interesting thing about Spock's character, is that he is supposed to not be influenced by emotion, not be influenced by biases, but to always operate solely on the grounds of logic. And, that's an interesting paradigm, and the truth is that he's an interesting character because he is unlike us. We have that same capacity, but we also have that capacity to believe things for reasons that are not good. And so this is just to introduce you to a couple of the ways that that works. Sometimes our beliefs are affected by not just biases that we know about, but biases that are unconscious to us, things that we don't really know about. And these are really a function of our psychology. Um, and so these things we refer to as cognitive biases. So here's an example of an argument, and I want you to really consider whether you think that this argument is good or not. Here's the argument. Premise one, all dogs are animals. Some dogs are not German Shepherds. Therefore, some dogs are not German Shepherds. So here's the point of this argument. At the end of the day, what I want you to believe is that some dogs are not German Shepherds. Okay, now why would people think that? Well, because all dogs are animals, and some animals that we know of are not German Shepherds. Now, is this good reasoning? It will look to many as though it is an example of good reasoning, but it is actually not good reasoning. Now, why? What's going on here? Why is this not good reasoning? It looks like it's good reasoning. Certainly everything we're saying here is true. It's true that all dogs are animals. It's certainly true that some animals are not German Shepherds, and it's certainly true that some dogs are not German Shepherds. So why is it the case that the first two claims are not good reason for supporting the final claim? Well, here's why. The form of the argument actually is this. We could substitute, I'm going to substitute certain things in here for animals and whatnot. But all German Shepherds are animals. That's true. Some animals are not dogs. That's true. Therefore, some German Shepherds are not dogs. Now, German Shepherds are dogs. But notice how the what's going on here is that the same form of reasoning is being used here as in the prior argument. The difference between the two is that the reasoning in the first argument included a conclusion that was true, so we were likely to accept the reasoning in that argument as good. Whereas in this argument, the conclusion is actually false, and that exposes to us that something is wrong here. But where we don't already accept the conclusion, we're prone to accept this form of reasoning as good. And that's a problem. That is, in fact, a belief bias, one of the cognitive biases that we have. So why does the first argument look better to you than the second? Possibly because of a belief bias, right? And that is the tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion. If we believe, let me just sort of go off the slides here for a second. If you're a theist, now a theist is someone who believes that God exists, you're more likely to accept as good an argument for God's existence, even if it's not a good one. You're more likely to accept it as true. Why? Because you believe the conclusion. And so you're willing to accept reasons for that conclusion that may not be good. Whereas if you do not believe that God exists, you're more likely to be far more critical and far more skeptical of any argument for the conclusion that God exists. Now, if you're an atheist and you do not believe that God exists, you're far more willing to accept arguments, the conclusion of which is that God does not exist. You will be less critical of those. You will perceive them as stronger arguments than they in fact are, and have a tendency to accept those arguments when they're not good. Whereas if you're a theist and an atheist has an argument that they've put forward, you're clearly much more skeptical and unaccepting of their thing. Well, why? Well, sometimes we tend to evaluate the reasoning of an argument, the movement from premises to conclusion, and whether premises support a conclusion based on really whether we accept the conclusion of the argument or not. And that first argument is an example of that. Closely related to belief bias is what we call a confirmation bias, and that's the tendency to attach more weight to evidence that supports our viewpoint. So we'll tend to, in this confirmation bias, we'll tend to look at things in the world as confirming what we already believe. Rather than objectively looking at it, we have a tendency as human beings to look at things in the world, and the things that supports our viewpoint is given more weight than something that doesn't. And in fact, if there's something that counts against a view that we already hold, we tend to be rather dismissive of that. And these are biases that we need to overcome if we are going to think clearly, critically, and rationally. And if we're going to become good critical thinkers. Evidence that supports a conclusion we agree with may well seem stronger than evidence that supports a conclusion we disagree with. Again, that's more on that bias. So that if you're a Democrat, you're going to embrace the idea that evidence from Fox News is biased. You're going to pretty much reject it out of hand. Why listen to them? They're this and this and this. You're going to reject any ideas that come from a Rush Limbaugh or a Sean Hannity or anybody that is deemed sort of a conservative person. Likewise, if you're a Republican, you're going to view um, the same sort of evidence as weak or unscientific, or you're going to view anything from, let's say, MSNBC with greater skepticism. Republicans, conservatives generally have see bias in or claim biases with PBS and a lot of the public stations. And so uh, where, if you're a Democrat, you're going to embrace the idea that Fox News is biased. If you're a Republican, you're going to say, well, no, they're not. And likewise, if you're a Republican, you're going to look at things said on MSNBC as rather biased. And if you're a Democrat, you know this is the right stuff. Um, why? Well, because it supports our preconceived views. Now, let's say that you're a Democrat and you embrace that Fox News has a bias. Um, Taking that same evidence, if you're a Republican, you probably will have a tendency to view that exact same evidence as both weak and unscientific. So that bias it's pretty pervasive, by the way, folks, and it's an interesting, particularly in years of presidential elections, um, it's very easy to see this sort of thing happen. All right, the moral of the story is that if our goal is to be objective and logical, we need to think even more critically about reasoning that supports our beliefs. Part of being a good critical thinker and is to be able to step back from our thinking, particularly for conclusions that we agree with, and really be honest about whether the reasons for that are good or bad. Now, people are afraid of that. They're afraid to question the reasons for the conclusions they already agree with because they don't want to be dissuaded. And it's because there's something personal invested for them in believing those things. It's a part of their entire worldview. It shapes their connections with their friends and their families. And so it's difficult if you are from a family that is traditionally very conservative, very Republican. It would be very, very difficult, particularly if you're close to your family, to sort of question the beliefs that the ideas that are being put out by them, because it not only is sort of uncomfortable for you personally, but it might strain family relationships and these sorts of things. So, and these are things that sort of get in our way of being clear and objective logical thinkers. Likewise, if you're raised in a traditionally Democrat family, perhaps more liberal, then you're um, really going to need to work hard to evaluate the ideas or the premises or the reasoning that supports your view. You need to think critically about it. Are these really good reasons for this? And to be frank with you now, this is actually a really important element of this class. One of the things that I really hope that we're able to gain from this class is to become intellectually honest and intellectually humble. Um, the reasons that people have for what they believe, um, oftentimes people will not want to challenge what they believe. They will not want to examine those reasons. And it's a fault of a person's character to sort of not want to really look at it and to just sort of dogmatically assert that certain things are true without being open to the idea that you may be wrong. Humble intellectual humility always acknowledges that we could be wrong. This is what we believe and this is why we believe it, but it's possible that we're incorrect, and being open to the idea that somebody could prove to you otherwise. If you're just sort of dogmatically asserting this, that I believe this and that's all there is to it, and are not open to even the possibility that you're wrong, then uh, you're biased, you're intellectually unhumble, and it's a bad place to be, actually. But anyways, let's keep rolling here. Belief bias is an important example of a cognitive bias. an unconscious psychological dynamic that skews belief formation, but there are others. And so let's talk about some of the other cognitive biases um, that are in your book and that we want you to sort of be aware of. The first one is an availability heuristic. And here's the interesting thing about an availability heuristic. That's when we assign a probability to a certain kind of event based not on how often the event actually occurs, but how often we think of it. Now, here's an example. Suppose that I'm in an airplane, and let's say that I have some fear of flying. And so because of my fear of flying, I consistently go back to thinking about the probability that the plane will crash and that we will not make it to our destination. And if I repeatedly think of this and repeatedly think of this, and I'm sort of coming up, forget, as I build up to when my flight is, let's say it's 2 months away, and every week I'm thinking about it and I'm thinking about it and I'm thinking about it, then an availability heuristic, we will overestimate the likelihood that that plane will go down, that that plane will crash, just because we think about it a lot. Another thing, now notice that heuristic, that availability heuristic is a bias born out of fear. As I described it, my fear motivated me to think about it a lot, and my thinking about it a lot led me to overestimate the probability of that sort of event. I am also personally deathly afraid of snakes. I hate snakes. I don't know about the rest of you, but I can't stand snakes. And what's interesting is, for a time I lived in Texas, and I remember driving down a street and seeing, just sitting on the sidewalk, a copperhead, which is a poisonous snake, and I remember just being, oh gosh, I just don't like that. And I found myself thinking about the possibility of snakes coming into my apartment. My apartment backed up to some woods, and into different places. And it really led me to think that it was much more likely than it was. Like, I was almost, there was a 50-50 chance that every time I went to bed at night, there was a rattlesnake sitting in my hallway. And these are the sort of, just because we think about it a lot, that doesn't, how often we think about something doesn't determine the likelihood that it will happen. The likelihood that a snake will end up in my apartment is very, 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 very slim. But I thought about it enough that it became a statistical likelihood to my mind. Well, that's a bias as well. The next one would be a false consensus effect. This is a tendency to assume that the attitudes held by us and by our peers are held by society at large. It's the idea that, hey, look, everyone I know thinks this, so don't we all really think this? Now, that happens a lot. That's a very common one. But this is where our conclusion is that society has this sort of view that we hold. But the only evidence that we have for that is that we don't know anyone who doesn't believe that, let's say, right? That's my attitude. Everyone I know in my family and my friends, or let's say, believe that, so clearly everyone believes that. Well, you're assuming that there's a consensus held by, let's say, society, that there's really no reason to believe that. You've got to recognize that people outside of your group will believe otherwise, and that your group is not somehow representative of society as a whole. Our American society is quite diverse, quite large, varied quite a bit. Having lived on both the East Coast, the West Coast, and then the South, and I suppose now I live in the North because I live in Ohio. If you do a North-South divide, let me tell you that people are very, very, very different. While there are a lot of things that are the same, our views about the world and about religion and about these things are not. All right, next one up will be the bandwagon effect. This one is great. A tendency to align our belief system with the belief systems of those around us. When we find that we are the only one who holds a certain view, but we're hanging out with a lot of people, a group of people, say, who hold another view, it is a matter of fact that the person who is alone in that belief will tend to sort of move their beliefs in the direction of that group. Um, we'll jump on the bandwagon, and there you go. If we're in a group who tends to to view well, shoot, give me, a very patriotic group, then we tend to be more patriotic. If we're in a group of people that tends to be more anarchist or sort of not like the system or hate the government, then our views tend to sort of move that direction. So then why are we in that case, sort of anti-government? Well, because those around us are, and that's not really a good reason to be anti-government. This bandwagon effect is kind of like um, something like a model of peer pressure. We feel the pressure to sort of fit in, perhaps with those around us, and so we tend to move our belief system to be like those around us. Um, this is the case even possibly when raw sense perception is affected by what other people say they're sensing. In other words, um, a study was done. There was a law school that did an interesting study. I should call it a study, but it was an interesting experiment where in the class they had the professor up front lecturing, and she had placed her purse on a tabletop somewhere near the door. And um, during the class, they had staged it so that someone bolted into the class, grabbed her purse, and then left. Now the person, and I don't remember the details, so I'm going to make them up. I don't remember what color shirt they were wearing. It was something significant and bold that was fairly easy to remember, either a bright red or a black or a white shirt that was, you see it and it's not like, well, that was taupe, like it was somewhere between, several different colors. It was clearly one color. And they asked people to go around and to give a description of the color of that person's shirt. And the people that were nearest to that event recognized that that person who took the purse had a red shirt. But they started in the back of the room asking what color was their shirt. And they had everybody but the people in the front of the class in on this. And they all said it was black, 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 black. They finally get to the people who were closest, who had the clearest view, who saw it, and they all said that the shirt was black. Why? Well, they aligned their beliefs with the beliefs of everyone around them, even though, and they acknowledged later, their sense perception was originally that it was red, but they came to believe that they were probably wrong if everybody else was asserting the contrary. So they changed their answer and came to believe, actually, that the shirt was black. So that's just another example. A negativity bias, I think we're getting close to rounding out. The negativity bias asserts that we weigh negative information more heavily than positive information. We like the dirt. We love to hear negative things about anybody. And we tend to give that more substance when we're assessing things, when we're thinking about things. Positive information doesn't weigh equally to negative. We just give all kinds of importance to negative information. And in fact, we are very quick to form negative judgments about people far more quickly than we are um, to form positive judgments about people. I mean, think about this. Do you find it easier to believe a nasty rumor about someone or to believe that they're a really good person? We are far more inclined to believe nasty rumors about people. This negativity bias is invariably why in political elections they go negative. Because if we were to run 2 points, one a positive point about ourselves and then a negative information about our opponent, we were running for some office, and we were to poll voters about which information they found most impacting on who they vote for, the negative information about your opponent will do more to sway people than the positive information about yourself, no matter what that positive information is. That is because we tend to give more weight to that negative information, and that's why political campaigns invariably turn negative. Um, this is also sort of witnessed in the fact that it's very hard for us, and you'll notice in a political year, um, I'm thinking of the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and now Donald Trump. Um, Boy, people either are a big fan of one, a big fan of the other, or a big fan of neither, and vehemently against both. It's a very interesting election. And let's say that you're a big Hillary Clinton supporter. Um, would you ever find yourself giving Donald Trump credit for anything? It would seem almost impossible to do that. I mean, for anything. In fact, you will take even something that could be conceived as positive about Donald Trump, you will believe as a negative. It is that pervasive. And if you're a Trump supporter, Hillary Clinton can do nothing right. And you will not likely be one, most Clinton supporters will not likely be one to give credit to, um, I'm sorry, most Donald Trump supporters are not going to give Hillary Clinton any credit whatsoever for anything. And those who are sort of none of the above category, not likely to think that either one of them can do anything correct. Why? Well, it really does show that people have a negativity bias. And just be aware of this. Look, I have a tendency. That's negative information, and so I'm more prone to believe that that's true. This comes through in class, by the way. I have a number of students who um, struggle with the class. Their experience may not be good or not be what they wanted it to be, and they're willing to believe all sorts of bad things about me as an instructor. Why? No, a lot of my online students have never really met me, but it's easier to believe that I'm a bad person or that I don't want you to succeed than it is to believe something else. It's very easy to do that, and likewise, online instructors can sometimes be prone to that as well. We have students who may ask for an extension on something because of an issue, and our negativity bias can come in, and we work hard not to have this. But we have been lied to in the past about. I've had one class where a girl's grandmother died, ostensibly, and so she had to go to the funeral. And then um, the next semester, a friend of mine had this student in her class, and the student used the same excuse on the same grandmother to miss another assignment. We get lied to. But so, but a negativity bias comes in with us when we get, requests for an extension or this or that, this happened or that happened, where we might not, we might believe initially a negative thing, or well, I'm not sure they're telling me the truth here, where there really is no good reason for that. So it happens for everybody. This is something that happens. It's pervasive, and again, our responsibility is to recognize that this is a natural human tendency, but that it's not logical, that it is a bias, that it is something negative, and that we need to overcome if we are going to be good, rational, critical thinkers, to be dispassionate in our thinking. Good thinking is, by the way, just so that we're clear, dispassionate thinking. It is absent of the biases that emotions brought into thinking invariably bring. And the negativity bias is one of them. Okay, an in-group bias. Oh, by the way, the last point on that was that it may be a negativity bias. Sometimes our history shows us a good correlation, and so we form a negative opinion because it's actually warranted. So it's not always that way, but it can be, and that's what we need to be aware of. All right, this next one is an in-group bias. This can take the form of employing stereotypes to explain the behavior of outsiders. We tend to be very generous to people who are in our group, whatever group that is. The most obvious would be sort of racial groups. We tend to assess the behavior of those in our ethnicity or in our group more charitably than those who are not of us. I think that there is a fair amount of this that goes on a daily basis. But, it can also take the form of automatically discounting arguments supporting the opinions of people who are not one of us, so that if there's someone with whom we disagree and they make an argument for something, but they're not really our group, in fact, we kind of view them as one of as very, very different than us, then we're really less inclined to think that they have good reasons for what they believe. We're more likely to think that there's something wrong with their argument, or to try to find a flaw in what they're saying, only because they're outside of our group. Think politically again here, Democrats and Republicans. If a Democrat develops an argument for something, a Republican is not likely to really consider it, because they're not one of us. And when a Democrat does something, you know, we're going to employ a stereotype to describe why they do what they do. Conversely, you know, there's the stereotype. Let's just make a specific stereotypes. Republicans are really just money grubbing, sort of, they're really just interested in advancing, profits. They're all about profits, profits, profits. Well, then we're going to employ that stereotype to explain their behavior. Why do they do that? Well, they're just profiteering. They're just, blah, 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 blah. Well, you're using a stereotype that distinguishes your group from their group to explain the behavior. You don't really know why they've done that. You haven't really asked. You haven't really heard their view. The same for Republicans judging Democrats. So that's the in-group bias. Coming close to the end here, fundamental attribution error. This is a tendency to hold those who are not one of us especially blameworthy for their actions. We tend to, again, not be very charitable to those who are not one of us. And in particular, when someone who is not one of us does something that is morally questionable or sort of a questionable behavior, we're going to hold them more blameworthy than people who are one of us. So, one of you robs a store. Well, you're more likely to, well, they needed to, or they were just goofing off, or they were just, they're just a little misguided and they just need to be put on the right track. But then if someone who's not one of you does the same thing, well, they're clearly a vicious and vile person and they need to be locked up. This is arguably what happens when it comes to unequal prison sentences for people of different races. What's going on here is a tendency to hold by juries those who aren't one of us really blameworthy for their actions. I think conversely, we tend to be rather dismissive. This is not necessarily the fundamental attribution error, but it's to be dismissive of those who have the same view as us. We tend to be much more charitable to them. But then there is the obedience to authority. This is also covered in your textbook. Tendency to go along with authority even against your better judgment. Now that's an interesting one. Um, in that one, what happens is, um, so, here's the great experiment on this. It's the Stanford prison experiment shows this. So if you've ever been exposed to the Stanford prison experiment, it illustrates precisely this point. In that experiment, um, they had certain authorities basically telling certain people, the subjects, that they needed to treat this other group sort of rather harshly and rather mean and actually immorally, and to cause them pain and to ignore their suffering. And the folks did that. Um, because the person in authority told them, no, that's okay, keep going. Um, Another psychological experiment that illustrates this, um, was one I watched a video on it in one of my undergraduate psychology courses, where they had subjects in one room, and every time a subject in an opposite room, which they could not see them, gave a wrong answer, they were to give them an electric shock. And um, they had this dial for how much shock to give them, and at first it's, mild, and then the dial goes up to, you know slightly painful, very painful, and then severely painful, and then, do not do this, basically. And the doctor kept coming in, and they would intentionally get the answers wrong to see if the person would push the button to cause them pain. And the person on the other side would, oh, stop, I don't want to do this anymore. But the um, subjects would continually press the button and actually raised it into dangerous levels, they thought, simply because somebody in a white lab coat came in and said, no, 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 that's okay. Go ahead and keep going, keep going, keep going. Even though it was against their better judgment, when they heard the person, when they saw the numbers and knew how much electricity they were sending to them and the pain that it was causing, their better judgment was, we need to stop this. But as soon as they got to that point, someone in a white lab coat would come in and say, no, 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 you're fine, just keep going, just keep going. And they would. Well, we have a tendency to do that. Advertisers sort of exploit this bias. When they want to sell us a product, they will invariably parade out someone in a white lab coat who is ostensibly an authority. People in white lab coats we view as authorities. People with stethoscopes we view as authorities. People with a badge we view as an authority. And we take these authorities and we tend to go along with their assessments even when it's against our better judgment. So that is the obedience to authority bias. Okay, the last one here is the overconfidence effect and better than average illusion. We overestimate our own abilities. We do this all the time. We are largely overconfident in what we can produce, in what we can do, and that becomes an issue. If we took a poll of the people in any given classroom and ask them whether they think that their intelligence is average, above average, or below average, um, the statistic is something like, and don't quote me on this, but it's something like 75% of the people will say that, or greater, will say that their intelligence is above average. Well, that can't be correct. And in fact, in one poll that was conducted, 95% of the people viewed their intelligence as above average. That can't quite be correct. Statistically, only 50%, actually only 49% can be above average. And 49% will be below average, right? So you're going to have, basically 1 to 2% is going to be average. This Why does that happen? Well, because we're very charitable to ourselves. And in fact, we oftentimes, things that count against our intelligence when we can't figure something out, or when there's something we can't do, we tend to think, well, that doesn't, that doesn't matter. That personally doesn't mean that I'm average. I'm still really, really smart. I'm just not good at that, we'll say, or something along those lines. Um, we also just, and this is clearly closely related, but we tend to think that we're better than the average, right? Overconfidence and better than average. You can see the relationship between the two. Okay, that's that for those lectures then, for those lessons, and we will pick up the next lesson then.